Ray Cole had driven the same highway for 11 years without anything unusual happening once. Not once. Not a close call with wildlife crossing the road at the wrong moment. Not a mechanical problem that left him sitting on the shoulder waiting for a tow. Not even a stretch of bad weather that made the drive genuinely difficult. 11 years of the same route through the same Montana flatlands 3 nights a week, and the most exciting thing that had ever happened was a deer standing in the middle of the road at mile marker 47 that stared at his headlights for about 30 seconds before deciding to move on. Ray was 44 years old and he had built his life around the kind of work that rewarded consistency. Show up. Do the job. Go home. He was not a complicated man and he did not think of that as a criticism of himself. He had a house he maintained carefully. A truck he knew the mechanical history of better than the dealership did. Hands that were useful and a mind that was practical and a general preference for questions that had answers over questions that did not. Philosophy had never interested him much. Neither had speculation. Ray dealt in what he could see and touch and verify, and that approach had served him well for 44 years without producing any situation he could not eventually work his way through. The highway at night was the part of his job he liked best. Not because of anything dramatic about it. Because of the opposite of dramatic. The flatlands stretched out on both sides of the road in a darkness that was total except for the stars, and the stars out here were the kind of stars that people who grew up in cities did not fully believe existed until they saw them. Thick and layered and so present that on a clear night the sky had genuine depth to it. Ray had driven under those stars so many times that he had stopped really seeing them years ago, the way you stop seeing the furniture in your own house. But on certain nights when the air was especially clear and the road was especially empty, they pushed their way back into his attention, and he would find himself glancing up through the windshield and thinking that this was actually something. That night started the same as every other night. Coffee in the cup holder. He had stopped at the gas station outside of Billings the way he always did and filled the largest cup they had and added exactly the amount of sugar he always added and put it in the cup holder and let it sit there, going gradually from hot to warm to the temperature he actually preferred to drink it at, which was somewhere in between. Radio playing low. Country station out of Great Falls that he had been listening to for so long he could predict the playlist rotation. The hum of the engine underneath everything else. That particular sound that a diesel engine makes when it is running well and has been running well for a long time and is simply doing what it was built to do. He had called in to dispatch around midnight. Standard check-in. Linda picked up on the second ring the way she always did, and they talked for about 2 minutes the way they always did. Nothing unusual on the route. Weather looked fine. ETA was on schedule. Linda told him the route out of Missoula had some construction delays and he said he would check the alternate. They said goodnight. He set the radio back in the holder and took a sip of his coffee and drove. For another hour nothing happened. The mile markers went by. The road bent gently left and then gently right and then straightened out again the way it always did. The stars overhead were particularly clear. Ray noticed them through the windshield and thought that briefly and then stopped thinking about them and thought about nothing in particular, the way a person thinks about nothing in particular when they are doing something familiar enough that it does not require conscious attention. Then something in the sky caught his eye. He was not sure what made him look at that specific patch of sky at that specific moment. There was no sound that drew his attention. No peripheral flash. He just looked up through the upper corner of the windshield and saw something that did not belong there. His brain ran through the standard list immediately the way a practical mind runs through a list. Plane. No. The movement was wrong. Planes move along a consistent arc. This thing changed direction. Not gradually the way a plane banks through a turn. Instantly. Like direction was something it could change its mind about without any of the physics that applied to everything else. Satellite. No. He had seen satellites before. They moved in straight lines at consistent speeds and disappeared over the horizon. This did not move in a straight line. Weather balloon. He had seen one of those once years ago and remembered it. Not this. This was none of the things on the list. He eased off the accelerator without fully deciding to. The thing moved in a way that his eyes understood as movement, but his brain kept struggling to file correctly because it violated something fundamental about how objects in the sky were supposed to behave. It covered distance and then stopped covering distance. Not decelerated. Stopped. The way you stop a video by pressing pause. Full speed and then motionless between one moment and the next with nothing in between. Ray pulled the truck over onto the shoulder and turned on the hazard lights out of habit and rolled down the window. The air that came in was cold and completely still. No wind. He leaned his head slightly out and looked up, and the thing was closer than it had been when he first noticed it. Descending. Still doing that impossible movement when it moved at all. Coming down toward the road with a directness that made his stomach tighten in a way he had not felt since he was a child and had understood for the first time that certain things in the world were genuinely outside his control. It stopped 50 feet above the highway. Just stopped. Hovering in the air above the road directly in front of his truck with the casual permanence of something that had decided this was where it was going to be and did not need anything to support that decision. It was large. He could not get a precise sense of the shape because the stars behind it were simply gone, blocked out across a wide circle that was significantly bigger than anything he had been expecting when he first pulled over. The shape was dark. Not reflective. No lights on it that he could see. No sound coming from it at all. He had expected sound. Everything that flew made sound. Even the quietest aircraft he had ever been near made something. This made nothing. The silence around it was the same silence as the empty flatlands around him. The same silence as the stars. Like the thing above the road had been part of the night sky all along and had simply moved to a different position in it. Ray sat in his cab and looked at it. He was not a man who panicked before he assessed. Panic came after assessment if the assessment warranted it. He sat and he looked and he tried to put together a rational framework for what he was seeing, and the rational framework kept coming back incomplete because there was a piece of this that did not fit into any rational framework he had available. Whatever was above his truck was not built by any human being. He knew it the way you know certain things. Not because he could prove it step by step. Because the thing in front of him exceeded every human reference point he had for what aircraft could do and what they looked like and what they weighed against the air and what sounds they made, and the excess was not slight. It was complete. This was something else entirely, and some part of him that lived below the level of rational processing had already understood that and had been tightening his stomach for the past 30 seconds because of it. He reached for the radio. He got one transmission out. He said his location and he said something was above him on the road and he said Linda's name. He was not sure if Linda heard any of it because the cab filled with light before he finished the sentence. Not headlights. Not a beam from above. Light that came from everywhere at once. Total and complete and so uniform that it eliminated shadow entirely. He could not see the windshield. He could not see his own hands. He could not see anything except white in every direction, and then he could not see that either because he was not there anymore in any way he could measure. Then nothing. Sheriff Dan Brooks got the call at 6:40 in the morning. A passing driver had spotted the truck sitting in the middle of the highway with its hazard lights still blinking and called it in. Dan drove out himself. He pulled up behind the truck and sat in his cruiser for a moment looking at it before he got out. Engine still running. He could hear it from where he sat. Radio still playing. The country station from Great Falls. Door hanging open on the driver's side. He walked up alongside the truck and looked in the cab. Coffee in the cup holder. He touched the cup. Cold. Whatever temperature the night had taken it down to over the course of several hours. No Ray. Dan stood beside the truck in the early morning light with his notebook open and his pen in his hand and looked at the cab and then looked at the road and then looked at the sky in the direction the truck had been facing. The sky was the ordinary blue of early morning. Nothing in it except a few thin clouds and the fading suggestion of stars near the horizon. He wrote down the time. He called it in as a missing person. He did not say out loud what he was thinking because what he was thinking did not belong in an official report, and also because saying it out loud would have made it more real, and he was not ready for that yet. 3 days would pass before anyone heard from Ray Cole again. The highway stayed quiet. The hazard lights kept blinking. The radio played the morning program and the coffee sat cold in the cup holder and the engine ran until Dan reached in and turned the key, and then the only sound was the wind coming across the flatlands and the distant suggestion of traffic from the highway 2 miles east. Dan stood beside the empty truck for a long time after he made his calls. He looked at the sky one more time. Then he got in his cruiser and drove back toward town and thought about a man he had known for 15 years who fixed things with his hands and did not believe in questions without answers and had been driving the same highway for 11 years without anything unusual happening once. Ray came back to consciousness the way you come back from a deep dreamless sleep. Not the groggy, uncertain kind of waking up where you spend the first few seconds unsure of where you are or what day it is or whether the alarm went off yet. Not the kind where your body feels heavy and your thoughts feel slow and the world comes back to you in pieces that take a while to assemble into something coherent. This was different. This was a clear, clean awareness arriving all at once like a light being switched on in a room that had been completely dark. One moment there was nothing and the next moment there was everything, and the transition between them had no length to it at all. Ray was awake. He knew he was awake the way he knew things that did not require verification. His eyes were open and the room around him was real, and he was lying on a surface that his back told him should have been hard based on what it looked like but was not. It gave slightly beneath his weight in a way that no material he had ever encountered gave. Not soft the way a mattress is soft. Something more precise than that. Like it was responding to the specific shape of him rather than just compressing under pressure the way cushioning compresses. He lay still for a moment and breathed. The air was something he noticed immediately. It tasted like nothing. Not the nothing of clean outdoor air which still carries something. The nothing of an absence. Like breathing in a room where every variable that air normally carries had been carefully removed and what was left was just the part that kept you alive without any of the other parts. He breathed it and his lungs worked fine with it and he noted that and moved on. The room was large. Dim in a way that was not uncomfortable. The light had no source he could identify. It did not come from fixtures on the ceiling or panels in the walls. It simply existed in the room the way temperature exists in a room. Distributed. Present everywhere equally. The walls and the floor and the ceiling were built from something he had no word for. Not metal. Not plastic. Not any composite material he had encountered in 44 years of working with his hands and fixing things and understanding through touch what things were made of and how they behaved. Whatever this was, it did not behave like anything he had a category for, and after a moment he stopped trying to categorize it and just let it be what it was. He sat up slowly. No dizziness. No nausea. His body felt exactly as it always felt, except perhaps slightly more rested than usual, which under the circumstances was strange enough to note. He sat on the edge of the surface and put his feet on the floor and felt the floor under his boots and looked around the room properly for the first time. 3 beings stood across the room from him. He saw them and did not react the way he might have expected himself to react. No sharp intake of breath. No scrambling backward. His body stayed still and his eyes stayed on them, and the part of his brain that assessed situations took over the way it always took over when something required assessment rather than reaction. They were tall. Significantly taller than him, and he was not a short man. Thin in a way that looked structural rather than unhealthy. Gray-blue skin that caught the sourceless light of the room differently than human skin caught light. Large dark eyes that were not shaped like human eyes and that did not blink in the interval he watched them. They stood without fidgeting. Without shifting weight. Without any of the small unconscious movements that humans make when they are standing still, because standing completely still is actually something humans are not very good at. They were watching him. Not with aggression. Not with the particular kind of attention that precedes a threat. With the patient, steady attention of things that had been watching for a long time and had developed through that long practice a quality of stillness that was different from anything Ray had encountered in a living creature before. They watched him the way a person watches something they have been waiting to see and have finally seen and are now simply taking the time to observe properly. Ray looked back at them. He assessed the room first. He looked at every surface and every angle and identified what might be a door and what might not be, and concluded that he could not recognize an exit because nothing in the room looked like any exit he had ever used. The beings next. He looked at them carefully and thought about what he knew, which was almost nothing, and what he could reasonably conclude, which was somewhat more. They had put him here. They had done it without hurting him. He was not restrained. The surface he had woken up on was comfortable. The air was breathable. None of those things were the choices of beings who intended to cause harm. If they had wanted to hurt him, they had already passed the best opportunity to do so. He decided he was not about to be hurt and filed that conclusion and moved forward from it. He stood up. His legs held him without any problem. He straightened to his full height, and the 3 beings across the room still did not move. He looked at them standing there watching him and thought about what a person does when they find themselves in a situation with no available handbook. His father had been a practical man too. Practical in the way that people who grew up with very little became practical because practical was what worked and everything else was a luxury. His father had given him very few pieces of specific advice, but one of them came to him now, standing in a room that no human being had ever stood in before. If you are ever lost, tell someone who you are. Ray opened his mouth and spoke out loud into the silence of the room. He said his name. Ray Cole. He said where he was from. Montana. United States. He said it clearly and without embarrassment, because embarrassment was not something that had any relevance to the current situation, and relevance was the filter Ray applied to everything. He said it the way you say something that needs to be said regardless of whether you are certain it will be understood. Because saying it was the right next step, and he had learned a long time ago that doing the right next step was usually more useful than waiting until you could see the whole staircase. Nothing happened immediately. Ray stood and breathed the tasteless air and looked at the 3 beings across the room and waited in the way he waited for things. Without impatience. Impatience was for situations where hurrying changed the outcome, and he could not identify how hurrying would change anything about this one. Then one of the 3 beings moved. It separated from the other 2 with a smoothness that was different from how humans move. Not slower. Not faster. Just differently. Like the mechanics of it operated on slightly different principles. It was shorter than the other 2. He had not noticed that while they were all standing together, but as it moved toward him the difference became clear. It also moved with something that his mind wanted to call intentionality. A quality of direction that communicated purpose without communicating threat. It stopped a few feet away from him. Ray looked at it and it looked at him, and then something happened that took him a very long time afterward to find adequate words for. He tried to describe it to different people on different occasions, and the description was never quite right because the experience did not fit cleanly into the language available for experiences that happen through normal channels. Information arrived in his mind. Not through his ears. Not as sound that he processed into meaning. The meaning arrived directly. Like the step of converting sound into understanding had been removed and only the understanding remained. It was not uncomfortable. It was not invasive in a way that felt like violation. It was simply there suddenly, the way a thought is simply there when your own mind produces it, except this thought had not come from his own mind. He was not in danger. He understood this not as a reassurance offered to calm him down, but as a statement of fact delivered with the same neutral directness that facts have when they are simply true. He was not in danger. The information arrived with the quality of something that did not need him to believe it to be true. He had been brought here deliberately. Not accidentally. Not because he happened to be in a location that was convenient for some other purpose. Someone or something had made a decision, and the decision had been about him specifically, in the sense that a decision had been made and he was the result of it. What he was about to be shown had been chosen carefully. Ray stood with that information in his mind and looked at the being in front of him and thought about it the way he thought about things. Turning it over. Looking at the different sides of it. A practical man confronted with something genuinely outside his experience still brings his practical mind to bear, because that is what the practical mind does. It does not shut down when the situation exceeds its reference points. It keeps working with whatever material is available. He had been brought here deliberately. He was about to be shown something that had been chosen carefully. He thought about what question to ask, and he considered several and discarded them because they were the questions of a person trying to establish the basic facts of the situation, and the basic facts had just been established with more directness than any conversation he had ever had. The basic facts were handled. He asked the only question that felt like it was actually worth asking. He said, "Why me?" The answer arrived the same way the rest had arrived. Without sound. Without ceremony. Without any quality of softening or preparation, as if the being in front of him understood that Ray was not someone who needed information cushioned before it was delivered. He had not been chosen because he was special. Ray received that and sat with it for a moment. There was something almost funny about it in a way that he did not quite feel like laughing at. He had not been chosen because he was special. He was not special. He had never thought of himself as special, and the universe had apparently taken a similar view. He had been chosen because he was there. On that road. At that moment. The highway at 2 in the morning, and the coffee going cold in the cup holder, and 11 years of the same route without anything unusual happening once. He had been in the right place at what had apparently been a very specific moment. And the moment had been waited for a very long time. Ray looked at the being standing a few feet away from him in a room built from materials he had no words for and thought about that. A very long time. He did not know yet what that meant in actual years, or what the moment was for, or what being there at that moment had made him the right person to bring here for. He did not have those answers yet. But he had learned something in 44 years of practical living that applied here as clearly as it applied anywhere. You did not need all the answers before you took the next step. You needed enough of them to know which direction to go. He looked at the being that had moved closer and communicated without sound, and waited for whatever came next with the steady patience of a man who had driven the same road for 11 years in the dark and understood in his bones that the only way forward was forward. The being Ray would later call the translator led him through the ship for what felt like hours. He called it the translator because that was the closest word he had for what it did. It took things that existed outside the range of anything Ray could process on his own and moved them across the gap into something he could hold in his mind. That was translation. The word was not perfect, but no word he had was perfect for anything on this ship, and he had decided early on that imperfect words were better than no words, because a man needed something to call things, or the things became impossible to think about clearly. He followed it through corridors that were not quite corridors in the way he understood corridors. The shape of them changed as he walked. Not dramatically. Not in a way that felt threatening or disorienting. Just in the way that a path through living landscape changes as you move through it. Responding to something. Adjusting. He stopped trying to understand the mechanism after a while and just walked. Time moved differently here. He had noticed it early and had tried at first to track how long they had been walking by counting steps or estimating distance, but both methods stopped working because his internal sense of duration kept drifting in ways that did not match what his body was telling him. He was not tired in the way he should have been tired if hours had passed. He was not hungry. He was not thirsty. His body reported a kind of steady baseline state that did not accumulate the signals that normally told him how much time had gone by. After a while he stopped trying to track it and simply accepted that time here was not the same thing time was on a Montana highway at 2 in the morning, and that accepting that was more useful than fighting it. He followed and he looked and he said very little. Not because he was afraid. Because there was too much to take in, and he understood instinctively that talking would have gotten in the way of seeing. Ray had always been better at observing than at filling silence. Some people talk to process. He processed by going quiet and letting things come to him, and he did that now. The first room the translator brought him to stopped him completely before he had taken 3 steps through the entrance. The walls were transparent. All of them. Every surface of the room, including what should have been the floor beneath his feet and the ceiling above his head, was clear in a way that glass was not quite clear. Glass had edges and thickness and caught light at certain angles and reminded you of its own existence. This material was not like that. It was simply not there in any way he could feel or see. He was standing inside a room and also standing in open space simultaneously, and his mind spent a long moment trying to reconcile those two things. Stars in every direction. Below him. Above him. To every side. The galaxy spread out in a completeness that no photograph had ever captured and no window had ever shown and no human mind had ever actually seen before, because seeing it required being inside it rather than looking at it from a surface. He was not looking at space. He was in it. Surrounded by it. The ship around him had ceased to register as present because the transparency was complete, and what remained was just him and the stars in every direction, stretching out to distances that made the concept of distance feel inadequate. He stood there for a long time without speaking. He thought about a lot of things standing there. About the highway and the flatlands and the 11 years of the same route. About Montana and the house he maintained carefully and the truck he knew the mechanical history of. About how large those things had always felt to him because they were his things and his life, and the scale of a person's life always feels appropriate to that person because it is the only scale they have. He thought about how small those things looked from here. Not in a way that hurt. Not in the way that smallness sometimes feels like diminishment. In the way that seeing the actual size of something changes your relationship to it without changing its value. His life was still his life. The highway was still the highway. But they existed inside something so much larger than the frame he had always used to hold them that the frame itself looked different now. He could not explain it better than that, and he did not try. He just stood in the middle of the stars and let it be what it was. Eventually the translator moved and he followed. The archive was further into the ship. He knew they had arrived before he fully understood what he was looking at, because something in the room had a quality of accumulated weight to it. The feeling of a place that holds a very large amount of something important. Libraries had it. Museums had it on good days. This room had it more completely than anything he had ever walked into. It was large. Larger than the transparent room. Columns of light stood from floor to ceiling in rows that extended further than he could see clearly from the entrance. Not solid light. Something that contained information the way books contain information, except without the pages and without the physical structure. He walked toward the nearest column and stopped a foot away from it and looked at it, and images moved through it. Sounds came from it at a level just below what he would have called audible, but that he could perceive somehow anyway. Data in a form that his mind could not directly read but could recognize as data, the way you recognize a language as a language even when you do not speak it. He walked along the columns slowly. He understood gradually what he was looking at. It took time, and the understanding built piece by piece, the way understanding builds when the thing being understood is genuinely large. Each column was a record. A civilization. Everything that civilization had done and built and lost and found and become from the beginning of its detectable existence to whatever point the record had been updated last. Images of worlds he had never seen. Structures built by hands or appendages or processes he could not name. Sounds that were clearly communication in some form even when he could not parse the meaning. Hundreds of civilizations. Maybe more. He stopped trying to count. Some of the records were dense and tall and clearly still being added to. Some were shorter. Complete in a way that records become complete when the thing they are documenting has ended. He understood without being told what a complete record meant. He walked past those ones a little faster without fully deciding to. He found Earth without difficulty. It was near the front of the archive, which he understood said something about the order of things, though he was not sure exactly what. He stood in front of Earth's column and looked at his own species the way an outsider looks at it, and the experience was strange in a way that stayed with him long after he left that room. He saw wars. He had known about the wars. Everyone knew about the wars. But seeing them recorded and stored alongside everything else humanity had done in the same neutral, careful way that everything else was stored removed the frame that living inside history puts around events. The wars were there. So was the art. So was the recovery after destruction and the building after loss and the arguing and the failing and the trying again and the moments of genuine beauty produced by a species that also produced a great deal of the opposite. All of it recorded with the same attention. None of it judged. None of it weighted as more important than any other part. He stood there and looked at his own species from the outside for the first time. It was a lot to hold. The translator waited beside him with the patient quality it had shown since the beginning, not hurrying him, not indicating that there was a schedule, just present and available when he was ready to continue. He appreciated that without finding a way to express it. When he finally moved away from Earth's column, the translator led him further along the archive, further back, into a section that felt different from the rest before he had consciously identified why it felt different. He looked at the columns in this section and understood after a moment. They did not have the quality of records. They had the quality of something else. The images in them were not fixed the way images of the past are fixed. They moved differently. Branch showed multiple versions of the same moment developing in different directions. Not history. Projection. Possible futures mapped out with the careful attention of beings who had watched enough civilizations complete their arc to understand what the variables looked like and where they tended to lead. He walked slowly along the section and looked at what was stored in it. Humanity appeared in these columns. Again and again across different projections and different branches and different possible versions of what came next. He looked at what he could perceive of how humanity appeared in these futures, and his mind worked to make sense of it with the tools he had available, which were not perfectly suited to the task but were what he had not conquered. That was the first thing he registered. In none of the projections that he could see did humanity appear as a species that had been overtaken or absorbed or ended by something external. Not primitive. Not a minor footnote referenced briefly in someone else's larger story. Not the background of another civilization's history. Something else. Something that he stood in front of for a long time trying to find the right frame for and could not quite reach. Not because the frame did not exist. Because the frame he would need to hold it properly was larger than any frame he had built in 44 years of practical living, and building a larger frame takes time. He stood in front of those projections and looked at what beings who had been traveling longer than human civilization had existed believed humanity might become. He was a truck driver from Montana who fixed things with his hands and drove the same highway 3 nights a week and had never given much thought to his place in the universe, because his place in the universe had always seemed like a settled question. A small house. A reliable truck. A route he knew every bend of. He stood in that room and thought about it for the first time. The thought was large. Larger than the room. Larger than the ship. Larger than anything he had tried to think before. He stood with it the way he stood with things that were too big to move quickly through. Patiently. Without rushing. Letting it take the time it needed. Outside the archive columns, the stars turned slowly and the ship moved through them, and the translator stood beside Ray Cole from Montana and waited with the particular patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had learned through that waiting that some things could not be hurried and that the ones worth waiting for were usually the ones that needed exactly the time they took. The translator brought Ray to a smaller room. He noticed the size of it immediately after everything else he had been through in the ship. The observation room with its transparent walls and the stars in every direction. The archive with its columns stretching further than he could see. Everything else had been large in a way that communicated scale deliberately. This room was different. It was the size of something built for 2 people to sit across from each other and talk. Not small exactly, but contained. Proportioned. The kind of size that a room gets when its purpose is conversation rather than impression. It felt like it had been built for exactly this. There was no other furniture. No other feature that drew the eye or demanded attention. Just the space and the sourceless light and 2 surfaces that functioned as seats positioned across from each other with a distance between them that was not too close and not too far. The distance you would choose if you were arranging a room for a conversation that needed to be heard clearly and taken seriously without feeling like an interrogation. Ray sat down. It was the first time he had sat since waking up, and he had not realized until the moment he did it how much his body had been waiting for the option. Not exhausted. Not in pain. Just ready to be still in the particular way that sitting allows you to be still. He settled into the surface and it adjusted to him the way the surface he had woken up on had adjusted, and he let it and looked across at the translator settling into the seat across from him. They sat facing each other in the quiet room. What arrived in Ray's mind now was different from before. The earlier communications had been direct and clean, but they had also been responsive. Answering what he asked. Delivering what was immediately needed. This was something else. This had the quality of something that had been organized in advance. Structured and sequenced and prepared with care, the way you prepare something when you have been thinking about how to deliver it for a long time and you want to get it right. This was the part that had been prepared. Ray sat and received it and did not interrupt because interrupting did not seem like it would serve any purpose, and also because what was arriving was large enough that interrupting it would have been like stepping into the middle of a sentence that needed to finish before the meaning of it became clear. The ship had been watching Earth for a very long time. That was where it started. A simple fact delivered with the same neutral directness that all the facts had been delivered with. No drama attached to it. No attempt to make it land as a revelation. Just the fact itself placed in front of him to hold. Ray held it and thought about what a very long time meant to beings who had been traveling the galaxy long enough to have filled an archive with the records of hundreds of civilizations. He thought about the column in the archive. His own species documented with careful attention across the full length of their detectable existence. The wars and the cities and the recovery and the invention all stored and observed from a distance. They had been watching all of it. Not casually. Not the way you glance at something that exists at the edge of your attention. With the focused, sustained attention of beings who had decided that what was happening on that particular world in that particular solar system was worth watching carefully. He thought about what that meant. To be watched that carefully for that long by something with the patience and the technology to do it without ever being detected. He did not know exactly how to feel about that, so he set the feeling aside and kept listening. They had watched humanity develop through every stage. The information arrived with the quality of something that had been observed rather than theorized. Not a guess about what humanity had gone through. A record of it. They had seen the early stages and the middle stages, and they had seen other civilizations go through similar stages enough times to know what the pattern looked like and where the pattern tended to go and which parts of the pattern were the ones that determined what came next. Most civilizations at humanity's current stage of development followed one of two paths. Ray received this and understood that what was coming next mattered and gave it the full attention it was asking for. The first path. A civilization discovered that it was not alone in the universe before it had developed the internal stability to hold that knowledge without being destabilized by it. The discovery came too early, too suddenly, too completely. And something broke inside that civilization that never fully healed. Not because the knowledge was inherently destructive. Because the civilization encountered it before it had built the internal framework that would have let it absorb something that large without losing its footing. Some of those civilizations recovered partially. Some did not recover in any meaningful sense. All of them were changed in ways they had not chosen and could not have anticipated and could not reverse once it happened. The second path. A civilization was given enough time. Time to develop not just technology but something harder to develop and harder to measure. A kind of collective stability. A relationship with uncertainty that had been tested enough times through enough different kinds of difficulty that when the largest uncertainty of all arrived, the civilization could stand inside it without collapsing. Those civilizations survived the knowledge. More than survived. They were changed by it in ways they had chosen, in the sense that they had been given the chance to develop the capacity to choose. Ray sat with those two paths and thought about which one humanity was on. Humanity was approaching a moment. Not tomorrow. He received that with clarity. Not next year. Not in the immediate future in the way that the word approaching sometimes implied. But soon, in the scale of things that operated on the timescales the ship operated on. A point was coming toward them the way a fixed point comes toward a moving vehicle. The distance was closing. The closing was not something that could be stopped. It was already in motion. The question of whether humanity was alone in the universe was going to be answered. Not because humanity had reached the point of being ready for the answer. Because events were already in motion that had their own momentum and their own timeline, and that momentum had reached the point where the outcome it was building toward was no longer preventable by anyone, including the beings on this ship who had been watching and had the knowledge and the technology that watching had given them. Other civilizations were becoming aware of Earth. Ray understood this not as a vague general statement but as a specific factual condition that already existed. Not might exist. Already existed. Other eyes in the galaxy were already turning toward that small blue world in that quiet solar system, and the process of turning was already underway and could not be recalled. Not all of those civilizations had the patience this one had. Ray sat with that sentence for a moment. He thought about patience as a quality. About what it meant for a civilization to have it or not have it, and what the difference looked like from the outside, and what it meant for the civilization on the receiving end of whichever kind showed up first. He thought about the archive. The columns that were shorter. Complete. The records of civilizations that had ended. He kept listening. The warning was not about invasion. The information arrived with a quality of wanting to be clear about this. Not invasion. Not war. Not the particular kind of threat that humanity's stories about contact with other civilizations almost always defaulted to, because humanity's stories were built from humanity's history, and humanity's history had a lot of arrival and conflict in it. The warning was about contact. And contact without preparation was its own kind of catastrophe. Ray thought about the two paths. About what broke in civilizations that encountered the knowledge too early. He thought about it not in the abstract way he might have thought about it a day ago, but in the concrete way that a man thinks about something when he has just walked through an archive full of records and seen with his own eyes what complete looked like as opposed to ongoing. Civilizations that were contacted before they were ready did not survive the contact intact. The information arrived with the careful specificity of something being stated precisely because precision mattered here. Not destroyed. The word destroyed did not arrive. Something more specific than that, and in some ways harder to process. They lost things. The things that made them worth knowing. The particular qualities that had developed over the long, complicated, messy process of a civilization building itself up from nothing. The curiosity and the creativity and the specific human way of approaching problems that came from having had to solve them the hard way over a very long time. Contact without preparation did not kill civilizations. It hollowed them. Left the structure standing but removed something from the inside that the structure had been built to house. And once it was gone, it did not come back because you could not rebuild from the inside of a hollowed thing the same way you could build from the outside of an intact one. Ray sat in the small room and received all of this without saying anything. He was not a person who spoke in the middle of things that needed to be finished. He was the kind of person who listened to the whole of something before deciding what to say about it, because saying something in the middle of it often meant saying something that the end of it would have answered if you had waited. He had learned that from his father and from 11 years of driving and from 44 years of general living, and it was one of the more useful things he had learned. When the information stopped arriving, he sat in the quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been building since the moment he woke up on that surface in that room with the three beings watching him from across the space. He said it out loud the way he had said his name out loud. Not because he was certain it would be received the way speaking worked between humans. Because saying things out loud was how he thought through them, and he needed to think through this one out loud. Why are you telling me? He let that sit for a second and then he said the rest of it. I drive a truck. I am one person. I live in Montana and I fix things with my hands, and I know the same highway so well I could drive it with my eyes closed. What am I supposed to do with any of this? What does one person do with something this size? The answer arrived. It was the simplest thing the translator had communicated since the beginning. Simpler than the archive and simpler than the warning and simpler than the two paths and what happened to civilizations that took the wrong one. Simple in the way that true things are often simple when you finally get to them after everything complicated that surrounds them. They were not telling governments. Governments would receive this information and they would do what governments did with information they could not control. They would classify it. They would argue about it internally for years while the window that had prompted the warning kept closing. They would use it to consolidate the kind of power that information like this gave to whoever held it exclusively. They would make it smaller by making it theirs. They were not telling scientists. Scientists would receive this information and they would do what scientists did with information they could not immediately verify. They would demand proof in forms that this ship could not provide without causing exactly the kind of unprepared contact the warning was about. They would spend the time they did not have arguing about methodology and reproducibility and peer review, and by the time the argument resolved, the moment would have passed. They were telling Ray. Because Ray would tell people. Not officials. Not institutions. Not anyone who would receive the information and immediately begin processing it through a structure designed to manage information rather than share it. People. The neighbors and the regulars at the diner and the other drivers at the depot and the people those people knew and the people those people told. The long, uncontrollable human chain of one person telling another person something true and that person telling someone else, and the information moving through the population the way things moved through populations before anyone had decided to manage the movement. That was how humanity had always actually prepared for anything that mattered. Not through official channels. Not through coordinated institutional responses. Through people talking to people. One conversation at a time. Imperfect and slow and impossible to control, and exactly as fast as it needed to be because it happened everywhere simultaneously the moment it started happening anywhere. Ray sat with that answer in the small quiet room. He thought about what it meant that beings who had watched hundreds of civilizations develop and who had traveled the galaxy long enough to fill an archive with those records had looked at all of that and looked at humanity and decided that one truck driver from Montana talking to his neighbors was the right place to start. He thought about what that said about humanity. About the way information moved through them. About the particular stubborn human habit of talking. Of telling things to other people not because a system required it but because humans were built to share what they knew and what they felt and what they were afraid of and what they hoped for, and the sharing itself was the mechanism. Not a symptom of something else. The actual mechanism. He sat in the quiet room and thought about that for a while. Then he asked one more question. He asked how much time humanity had. The answer arrived in his mind and settled there with the weight of something true and something heavy and something that needed to be carried carefully. He closed his eyes when it arrived and was quiet for a long moment. Outside the small room the ship moved through the dark between stars and the archive held its records and the stars turned slowly in the transparent walls of a room further back in the ship and Ray Cole from Montana sat in the quiet with his eyes closed and held the weight of what he had just been given and thought about what a person did with something this large when they were just one person and the answer they had been given was that one person was exactly enough to start with. Ray was standing on the highway at 4 in the morning when Sheriff Dan's cruiser came around the bend. He had been standing there for about 20 minutes before the headlights appeared in the distance. He knew it was 20 minutes because the cold had worked its way through his jacket in the particular gradual way that cold works through things when you are standing still and not generating enough movement to push back against it, and he had been tracking the cold the way he tracked things without consciously deciding to. 20 minutes of standing on the same stretch of highway where his truck had been found 3 days ago, looking up at a sky that held nothing unusual. Just stars. The same stars that had always been there. The same ones he had driven under 3 nights a week for 11 years without thinking much about what they were or what might be moving through the space between them. He heard the engine before he saw the lights. Sound carried a long way on flat empty land at 4 in the morning, and the engine of Dan's cruiser was familiar to him in the way that things in a small town become familiar. You hear them enough times in enough contexts and they stop being anonymous sounds and start being specific ones that belong to specific things. Ray heard it coming around the long bend to the east and stood where he was and waited. The headlights swept across the road and found him. Dan brought the cruiser to a stop about 30 feet back and sat in it for a moment before he got out. Ray could see him through the windshield. Just sitting. Looking. The engine idling. Then the door opened and Dan stepped out into the cold and stood in his own headlights and looked at Ray from across the distance between them. Dan was a man who had seen a lot of things in his years of doing what he did. Not in the dramatic way that got written about. In the quiet accumulative way of someone who shows up to the scenes of things that happen to people in a rural county and does the job that needs doing and goes home and comes back the next day and does it again. He had seen things that stayed with him and things that he had managed to set down eventually and a few things that he was not sure he had fully processed even now. He looked at Ray for a long moment. No injuries that he could see from here. Standing straight. Steady on his feet. Same jacket Ray had been wearing 3 days ago when his truck was found empty on this same stretch of road. The jacket looked clean, which was one of the details that Dan's mind filed without him deciding to file it. 3 days gone and the jacket was clean. He did not know what to do with that detail, so he set it aside and walked forward. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Ray's face. Ray looked back at him. The expression on Ray's face was not the expression Dan had been quietly preparing himself for during the drive out. Not confusion or distress or the particular blankness that sometimes came over people who had been through something their mind was still trying to process. Ray looked like Ray. Tired in a normal way. Present. Thinking about something. The same face Dan had seen across the counter at the diner and in the hardware store parking lot and at the occasional town meeting for 15 years. Dan said his name. Just that. Just Ray. Ray said, "Hey Dan." They stood on the highway in the cold for a moment and the headlights of the cruiser lit up the road behind Ray and the stars were very clear overhead and neither of them said anything else for a few seconds because some situations require a moment before the practical part begins. Then Dan said, "Are you hurt?" Ray said no. Dan said, "Okay. Let's get you warm." He drove Ray to the station. Not the hospital. Not because he was not concerned but because Ray had said he was not hurt and Dan had looked at him carefully in the light of the cruiser interior and believed him and the station was closer and had coffee and a plain table to sit across from each other at, which was what this situation seemed to need more than anything a hospital could provide. He got Ray a coffee and got one for himself and sat down across from him and put his notebook on the table and his pen beside it and looked at Ray and said what happened. Ray told him everything. He told it the same way he told things. Plainly and in order. Starting at the beginning, which was the light in the sky, and going through to the end, which was waking up on the highway 20 minutes ago with the cold working through his jacket and the stars overhead and no ship visible anywhere. He did not editorialize. He did not try to make it sound more believable by softening the parts that sounded least believable. He just told it the way it had happened because that was the only way he knew how to tell things and also because the translator had chosen him in part for exactly that quality and somewhere in the back of his mind he understood that. Dan listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not write anything in the notebook. He sat with his coffee in both hands and his eyes on Ray and he listened the way a person listens when they are deciding not just what they think about the information but what they think about the person delivering it. Ray was not a man who made things up. Dan had known him 15 years, and in 15 years Ray had not once said something that turned out to be untrue or exaggerated or shaped to serve a purpose other than accuracy. He was not the kind of man who invented things. He did not have the personality for it. He was too practical and too uninterested in the impression he made on other people to bother. When Ray finished, Dan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Ray. He picked up the pen. He looked at the notebook. He thought about what an official report that contained what Ray had just told him would look like and what would happen to it and what would happen to Ray as a result of it, and he set the pen back down. He did not write any of it in the official report. Not because he doubted Ray. He had made his decision about that while Ray was still talking. Because he had been doing this job long enough to know what happened to official reports that contained certain kinds of information. They disappeared into processes that were designed to manage them rather than act on them. They generated attention of a kind that did not help the person at the center of it. They created a version of events that got stored somewhere and referenced occasionally and never actually did the thing that reporting something was supposed to do. He wrote missing person resolved in the incident log. He noted that Ray had been found unharmed on the highway at approximately 4:15 in the morning. He noted that Ray had no memory of his whereabouts during the intervening period. That last part was not true, but it was the kind of not true that Dan decided he could live with. He drove Ray home. They did not talk much on the drive. Dan asked once if Ray wanted him to call anyone, and Ray said not yet. Dan nodded and drove. When he pulled up in front of Ray's house, he put the car in park and sat for a moment and then said, "If you need anything." Ray said, "I know." He got out and walked to his front door and went inside. Dan sat in the cruiser in front of the dark house for a while before he drove away. He looked at the sky through the windshield. He thought about 15 years of knowing Ray Cole. He thought about the empty truck with the engine running and the coffee cold in the cup holder and the door hanging open. He thought about what Ray had just spent an hour telling him in a plain voice without embellishment. He drove back to the station and sat at his desk and did not sleep for a while. Ray sat at his kitchen table. He did not turn on many lights. Just the one over the table. He sat in the small circle of it in the quiet house and looked at the surface of the table and thought about everything the way he thought about things that were large. Giving it time. Not rushing toward conclusions. Just sitting with the weight of it and letting his mind move through it at whatever pace it needed. He made a cup of coffee at some point, drank half of it, let the other half go cold. When the sky outside the kitchen window started showing the first gray suggestion of morning, he picked up his phone and called Carol. She answered on the third ring with the alert voice of someone who had been sleeping lightly and was not entirely surprised to be woken at this hour by her brother. Carol was 4 years older than Ray and cut from the same material. Practical. Straightforward. She did not believe in things she could not see or verify, and she had a reliable sense for when someone was telling her the truth and when they were not. Ray told her everything. The same way he had told Dan. Plain and in order, without embellishment. He did not skip the parts that sounded unbelievable because skipping them would have been dishonest, and dishonesty with Carol had never worked anyway. She listened without interrupting, which was something she had always been better at than most people. When he finished, there was a silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who did not believe him. Carol's silences had different qualities and Ray knew them all, and this one was the silence of someone processing something large and doing it carefully. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then she said, "What are you going to do with it?" Ray had been sitting with that question since the small quiet room on the ship. Since the translator had delivered the simplest and in some ways the most difficult thing it had communicated. He was not important. He did not have a platform. He did not know anyone significant in any of the ways that the world usually measured significance. He was a truck driver from Montana who fixed things with his hands and drove the same highway 3 nights a week. He thought about people telling people. He thought about every person he knew. His neighbors on both sides. The guys he had coffee with at the diner on Tuesday mornings. The other drivers at the depot who he had worked alongside for years. The woman at the hardware store who knew his name. The people at the gas station outside Billings where he stopped every night he worked. Not many people individually. But each of those people knew people. And those people knew people. And the chain of it went out from him in every direction the way chains always went when one person started them. He started talking. Not to officials. Not to journalists or researchers or anyone who would receive what he said and immediately begin processing it through a structure built to manage information rather than carry it. To people. To the neighbor who came over the following Saturday to borrow a tool and stayed for an hour. To the guys at the diner who he sat with the following Tuesday morning. To the other drivers at the depot who he worked alongside and who knew him well enough to hear what he was saying without the filter of thinking he was the kind of person who said things like this. He did not perform it. He did not present it. He told it the same way he had told Dan and Carol. Plain and in order. without trying to convince anyone of anything. He said what he saw and what he was shown and what he was told, and he let the people he told decide what to do with it. Some of them he never knew what they did with it. Some of them he found out later had told someone else the same week. Some of them called him afterward with questions, and he answered the questions the same way he answered everything. Some people laughed. He expected that, and it did not bother him the way it might have bothered someone who was invested in being believed. Ray was not invested in being believed. He was invested in telling the truth, and those were different things, and only one of them was his responsibility. Some people went quiet in a way that told him the information had landed somewhere real in them, even if they were not ready to say so. He recognized that kind of quiet. He had been in it himself, sitting at his kitchen table in the early morning with the coffee going cold. Some people told someone else. The story spread in the way things spread when they are carried by people rather than pushed through systems. Slowly at first, and then with a momentum that did not require Ray to do anything to sustain it because it was sustaining itself. He heard about it coming back to him from directions he had not sent it in. A cousin of someone he had told mentioning it to someone who mentioned it to someone who called Ray directly. He took those calls and answered them the same way he answered everything. He went back to driving his route 3 nights a week. Same highway. Same radio. He got a different brand of coffee because something about the old brand tasted different to him now, and he could not explain why and did not try to. He drove and he listened to the radio and he looked at the sky more than he used to. Not searching. Just looking. The way your relationship to something changes after you have learned something true about it that you cannot unlearn. The sky was the same sky. The stars were the same stars. They meant something different now, and that difference was permanent, and Ray had made his peace with permanent things being permanent because that was what practical people did with things they could not change. He did not know if what he was doing would add up to anything. He thought about that sometimes on the long empty stretches of the route where there was nothing to do but drive and think. About whether one person talking to people he knew was actually enough to matter. About whether the conversations were building towards something or just spreading out into the world and dissolving. He did not have a way to know, and he was honest with himself about not having a way to know because honesty was one of the things he was consistent about. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had been shown in a room full of stored light and in a transparent room full of stars and in a small quiet room that felt like it had been built for exactly the conversation that happened in it. He knew what he had been told, and he knew why he had been told it, and he knew that the beings who had chosen to tell him had looked at all of humanity and all of history and all of what people telling people had accomplished across thousands of years of human civilization and had decided that it was still the right mechanism. Still the thing that worked when other things did not. He drove the highway and looked at the stars and thought about that. About a species that had been building and failing and recovering and trying again since before it had cities to do any of those things in. About every time in human history that something too large to hold had eventually been held because enough people had talked about it long enough that the holding became possible. About the particular stubborn human tendency to keep going that the archive had recorded across the whole length of human existence with the same careful neutral attention it gave to everything. He thought that maybe the beings on that ship had been watching long enough to understand something about humanity that humanity sometimes forgot about itself. That it had always been one person at a time. Every single thing that had ever changed had started with one person saying something true to another person who told someone else. Every movement and every shift and every moment when the world turned out to be different than it had been the day before had that same beginning somewhere back in its history. One person. One conversation. The chain of it going out from there in directions nobody could predict or control and reaching places nobody had planned for it to reach. Ray Cole from Montana drove his route and looked at his stars and thought that maybe one person was always where it started. And maybe that was not a small thing. Maybe that was the whole thing.